A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase.
I tell you what, if there was an award for world's tightest hamstrings, I think I'd be in with a shout at the moment. Also, I think the sunglasses lenses was a bit optimistic today. The forecast was for amazing winter light all day, but no, the cloud cover has come and all the frost has gone.
Well, that is as interesting as yesterday got, believe it or not. I went out on my bike in the hope of making a photography video on my bike, but that'll have to wait because I didn't take a single photo. It was rubbish.
I love being a photographer.
So today we're going to talk about camera settings, which I appreciate sounds quite boring, really, but I think actually it's integral to certainly how I take photos, and therefore my hope is that it'll be of interest to at least some of you. And if what I'm saying isn't, hopefully the comments of this video will be, because often in videos like this, people will leave comments about sort of variations of what I've said that they use, or out and out disagreements, which can also be interesting. Also, in case this does turn out to be a boring topic, I shall pepper this video with some footage and photos from my trip to Portugal a few weeks back. Give the video some colour. Yeah. Right, now first things first, I use custom modes for my settings, and I do so for a couple of reasons. Number one, consistency. It basically means that every time I turn my camera on, the settings are exactly the same as the last time I turned my camera on, and the time before that, then all the times before that. Which leads to the second reason I use custom modes, speed, because if I need to change any settings when I turn my camera on, I know my starting point, and therefore it's very quick and easy to make adjustments on the fly. And in practice, it just means that if I'm out for a bright sunrise, then my settings are never the same as the night before when I was shooting like a gloomy blue hour, which used to happen to me all the time. I'd shoot like the first hour of a nice bright sunrise at a really high ISO because that's what I was using the night before. Caught me out a lot, doesn't so much anymore because I use custom modes. So, custom mode number one that I use 80% of the time. What is that made up of? Well, the first and probably the most impactful setting that I use is minimum shutter speed. And I use this setting as a default because more often than not, whatever I'm shooting doesn't require a specific shutter speed. It just requires one that's fast enough to guarantee me a sharp photo. And if there's nothing moving in the scene, which for the most part is the case in my photos, then I know that at the focal lengths I use typically, a 30th of a second is plenty to get a sharp shot. Now the stabilisation on this A7R5 is phenomenal. I mean, I can take photos of a second and a half handheld, knowing that I'm going to get a sharp photo so long as the focal length is sensible. But more often than not, I'm shooting in bright daylight and you don't need an exposure of a second or more. So yeah, 30th of a second, 60th of a second, something around there is usually the sweet spot for me. And I've just got a button set up on the back of the camera, C4 in this case, that I can use to adjust my minimum shutter speed. And of course there are times when I do want a specific shutter speed, but when that's the case, I just flick the dial to shutter priority and select it from there. Now, in order for minimum shutter speed to work, the camera needs to be given the flexibility to adjust one of the other parameters that affects the exposure. And for me at least, that is an aperture, because I like to adjust my aperture manually on the lens. All my lenses have got an aperture ring. Some people much prefer to do it on the dials. I like using an aperture ring. But that means that the camera needs to be given the flexibility to adjust ISO, which is why I use auto ISO. Now, if I'm shooting in really bright conditions, typically what I'll do is have an ISO range available to the camera between ISO 100, which is the base ISO, and ISO 12,800 or something around there. And that might differ camera to camera, but basically an ISO where the files are still usable. But sometimes I will set my minimum ISO to 320, 400, and I'll do that because the difference in the files in terms of dynamic range and noise is so slight that I would prefer the camera to be shooting at higher shutter speeds than to be getting slightly cleaner files that really aren't going to make a difference to me in the real world. But yeah, in short, my camera spends its time trying to work out what the ISO needs to be to get a shutter speed of at least a 30th of a second. For metering, I use multi-metering, and I just adjust my exposure by eye. I don't bother with zebras or histograms. I don't really trust those on the back of a camera. And to tell you the truth, I never really have problems with exposure out in the field. I think people get too hung up on exposure, particularly nowadays with modern cameras. It's a thing of the past to have to think about things like exposing to the right. It's not really necessary anymore, in my opinion. Auto white balance, I'm shooting raw, so if the camera gets it wrong, it doesn't matter. And then for focus, I'm using a small single point somewhere in the middle of the camera, and I'll just use the joystick to adjust where I'm focusing. And I'll be using AFS typically, and I use back button focus as well. So if I press this button, the focus is on, and that just means I can lock focus, safe in the knowledge that the camera won't keep refocusing if I don't want it to. Mechanical shutter, I don't really like to use the electronic shutter if I don't have to. And this button on the side of the lens, and all my lenses, I use for IAF. So as soon as I press this, it will find an eye somewhere in the scene and lock onto it. So that's quite handy for shooting pictures of Noah or some street photography, things like that. And as I say, they are the settings that I use for probably 80% of my photos. I'm being a bit mischievous, just kicking some oranges into position. Now mode number 2 is somewhat different because often I'll be out shooting somewhere and I'll see something which is fleeting and fast moving and I want to take a photo of it immediately. And in that scenario, I want to be able to turn on my camera and go straight to a mode where I know I don't need to change any settings. And what that requires is a fast shutter speed to make sure that I get a sharp shot regardless of how fast anything in the frame is moving. And so I've got my minimum shutter speed set to 1,000th of a second. I'm also in a high burst rate in this mode, which is not particularly fast on this camera, but does the job. And as far as autofocus goes, I've still got single point, but it's single point tracking. So as soon as I half press the shutter, the camera will start tracking whatever was on the initial focus point. And I think the only other noteworthy thing about mode 2 for me is that my metering has changed to highlight weighted. And so this setting basically does what it says on the tin. Protects the highlights and makes sure that my exposure isn't crazy. And then finally, mode 3 is exactly the same as mode 2, but just with an electronic shutter. So if I'm shooting in a fast-paced environment and I don't want people knowing I'm taking photos, then I'll use the silent electronic shutter. So that's what 3 is for. And that's basically it. That's how I set up my camera. So yeah, let me know if that was interesting or useful, or both, or neither. But either way, thank you so much for watching. And a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. Now I mentioned a couple of weeks back that I've started blogging. I've just written my second blog post, which is all about my favourite photos of this year that I've taken around Europe and the world. And yeah, I think I'm really going to enjoy blogging, and Squarespace makes it very easy to do. Just as they make having an online store very easy, or sending out newsletters, or having a portfolio, it basically means having a functional website for your business or your hobby. Child's play, and I absolutely love it. And please let me know if you can think of anything that I should write about on my blog, because as much as I love it, I probably do need some ideas. Anyway, huge thank you to Squarespace for their continued support of this channel. If you would like to check out Squarespace, maybe you want a portfolio of your own or a blog, then just go to squarespace.com to start your free trial. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you can get 10% off your first purchase. So a big thank you to them for their continued support. And again, to you for watching. Hopefully next time I'll be out on my bike, but probably not, because the forecast is rubbish for the foreseeable.